How's it going, friends? Hopefully you guys are doing well. I decided to upload these interviews I have for the podcast onto our YouTube channel for your convenience and just so it could be easier for you to get back to if you guys ever want to in the future. I truly believe that these interviews and discussions I have with my friends and church leaders, that they will benefit you and the rest of the body and whoever listens. So I definitely want you guys to share this video. And if you do want to have early access to these discussions, then we first upload them on the podcast. So every Tuesday and Thursday, you'll find a new episode, and that's where you'll find these interviews and these discussions and teachings uploaded first. So what I uploaded for you guys today is a discussion I had with my pastor, Reverend Randy Martin. He's a PCA minister, a teaching elder here in Bakersfield, California, and he just has so much wisdom and so much experience in the Christian faith that I just really want to share with anyone who wants to listen. So in this discussion, we talk about his debate with atheist and constitutional lawyer Eddie Tabash, and this was about 10 years ago. So there's so much to think about since then, and man, I'm so glad I had this conversation with him. I learned a lot, and also things made, just knowing the context of the debate and everything surrounding it made a lot more sense. And then he also gives some really good tips on evangelism, apologetics. He gets deep into free will and Reformed theology. I mean, it's only an hour long. It was a helpful and beneficial discussion to have. So I pray that you guys benefit from it. So yeah, so here you go. Once again, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or any platform that you use. I'll greatly appreciate it. All right, guys, enjoy. So guys, Randy's my pastor, also a mentor and a friend. He was there for me in a time in my life that I really needed someone to look up to and to train me, even before being a member of his church. So Randy, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. It's good to be here, Arturo.
On the polemical edition, the reason why I brought that up is because I have an intro on there where Greg Bonson is debating, is it Tabash? Tabash, right? Tabash. Yes. And I love it because he's someone that you debated as well.
Yes.
And I came across presuppositional apologetics probably in 2011, 2012, and then I found out like a year later that you actually debated this guy, and I thought that's pretty cool, So we're gonna want to do a recap on that debate, but before we do that, Randy, I want people to know you a little more. So how long have you been a believer?
Oh, let's see. I'm 67, so I guess that would be about 57 years. Sometime when I was around, probably when I was 9, is when I had my initial and I think definitive conversion. Southern Baptist Church, hearing the preaching, the altar call, could not stay in the pew. Went forward, and a week later, Sunday night service, was baptized. And I believe that was a bona fide conversion to Christ. It wasn't a matter of praying the sinner's prayer. It was actually a matter of recognizing and believing that Christ had actually died for me, that he had paid for my sins, and that I truly had forgiveness for my sins, past, present, and future, because of the work of Christ on my behalf.
Awesome. Because I know you're ready. It's kind of interesting what happened later on in your life during seminary and college, and in just your personal life. It's encouraging to me to know these things. So, obviously we don't have too much time to go over everything. We've had years and years to talk about these things, and
yes.
and I know you know this already, but it's really affected my life, and it's really shifted me. I believe in a good direction. With being a family man now, I have 2 kids. And there will be a time where we talk about those mentorship meetings.
Okay.
And because I do know you love sharing a story, a question that we asked you, and
right.
and so that'll be for another time.
All right.
And I love those stories as well. So in 2010, you had a debate with Eddie Tabash, right?
Yes.
Well, personally, I think Eddie is probably the most underrated, or probably he's not as well known as these other guys, but I think he's probably one of the best debaters, and I think it's because he's a constitutional lawyer.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
he's a skilled debater. He loves debates. Yes. I remember before the debate started, he was like a little kid. He's all, clapping his hand, and I don't know if you saw the video, but he was so excited to start the debate, And it really caused me to want to pray for the guy, because I love people saying excited, but I want them excited for the right reason,
Sure.
And so, but anyways, Eddie, I know Bonson debated him, What's interesting is that you and Bonson have the same approach. You guys have a similar approach as far as
Yes.
using presuppositional apologetics.
Right.
So I kind of want to talk about those two things,
Okay.
your debate and also the method that we use for apologetics.
Sure.
In the debate, the very beginning, the announcer, he mentions your background, and he says that, that you had experiences in seminary and college that really helped you defend the faith. Do you have any story that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think that, and I credit God to this, and I credit the Holy Spirit's work at that particular moment when this happened. But during my summers, when I was going to college, I worked for the Kern County Fire Department. I don't know if they still continue the program, but back then they would hire college students usually, and employ them as extra help, summer seasonals. And this was my 5th summer doing that kind of work. And so I always had guys who were my age, maybe a little bit younger, maybe a little bit older, who were working along with me. My routine was every night after dinner, I would go into the kitchen area. Usually had some privacy there. We get out my Bible and notebook, and I would do my devotions and study and so forth. And 2 young fellows stopped into the kitchen that night, and they basically said something like this to me: "Why do you believe in God?" And in that moment, what hit me was that question doesn't go very far. You don't know the motives of those who were asking the question. You don't know if this is an ultimate kind of concern on their part or just a curiosity.
Right.
And so my response was, I really don't think that question is all that significant. That is, why do you believe in God? Clearly, there are many, many, many people in our country who believe in God, and it doesn't appear to really alter how they live their lives. I said the significant question, I think, is this: if you came to believe that God truly exists, would you give your life over to him completely and serve him with the rest of your life? I said, that's the significant question. Would you? If you came to believe that God truly existed, would you? And I looked at both of these young men, and I put the question directly to both of them. So one young man thought about it for a moment and quickly said, no, if I came to believe that God existed, I wouldn't change my life at all. The second young man thought about it and said, if I came to believe in God, I think it would change everything. He came to me later and said, okay, I see what you're saying. How do I come to know whether God exists or not? How do I come to know? And I said, the most powerful witness and testimony and proof that God exists is found in Bible reading. You need to read the Bible. If you've never read it, then you really don't understand what the message of the Bible is, and you don't really understand who the God is that actually exists. He followed my directions and went to the Berean bookstore, bought a New American Standard Translation. I gave him some guidance that he needed to start in the Gospel of John. That was in July. Had no idea what happened until October, when he wrote me a letter to tell me that the previous week he had been baptized, and that 2 weeks earlier he had come to the conviction that Jesus was truly the Son of God, and that he needed to give his life over to him. So for me, it's always critical to discern whether people are dealing with you at the curiosity level, or at the level of antagonism, or at the level of genuine seeking after truth. And we deal with each one of those in a different way. I don't think we're obligated morally to deal with the people who are just being argumentative and who just simply want to win points. I think we have some obligation to people who aren't yet seekers, but who have serious intellectual issues. And of course, we always should be taking people that we know are sincere. They're really asking, yeah, I really want to know what the truth is in all of this, and do our very best to help them to see who God is, what Scripture has to say, and what Christ has done for us.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. It's so it went from asking
How do you know God exists? Or why do you believe that God
why do you
exists?
believe that?
Why do you believe that God
And then he changed
exists?
his question to
If you came to believe that God truly existed, would you give your
yeah,
life over to him completely?
right, yeah.
That's the question.
And then he asked, okay, well, how do I come to know God?
Yes.
Oh,
It's a watershed
sequence.
kind of
Yeah, yeah,
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I still do wonder sometimes, when people ask me similar questions, whether it be at work or at school or anywhere, they'll ask, okay, well, like, why do you believe in God? And in my mind, I'm like, all right, there's the Bonson approach, there's the
And so what we ought to do is respond in that situation to say, are you asking a question about me? Or are you asking a question about God and his existence?
yeah, there. Okay, I see what you're saying. That's a
Because
good
if you
one.
just ask this question
Yeah,
about me, it hardly matters if I believe in God or not.
right, right.
What really
Yeah,
matters is, does God actually exist?
yeah, yeah,
And what
exactly.
matters beyond that is, if he did exist and you came to know that he existed,
Mhm.
would you do what you ought to do with that? And that is to serve him with your whole heart and
Right,
life.
right. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Again, that debate was about 2 hours long, around there, right?
About 2.5.
Yeah, two and a half.
Totally, yes.
Yeah, and even if some people might think that's a long time, really it's not that long. I couldn't imagine there was so much more you wanted to say. You've mentored me, so I know you can go on for a long time. And and I'm sure the same thing with Eddie. I'm sure he could have. And I'm calling you guys by your first name because even in the debate, you guys
Yes,
agreed
he
to.
wanted the debate to be, in that sense, sort of colloquial, friendly.
Okay.
Uh, the formality of the debate, and I'll say something about that. The formality of the debate, he wanted that formality to be cloaked in a friendly kind of, let's be
Okay.
on a first name basis. Let's remove all that kind of pretense
Hmm.
and let the form and structure of the debate be the form and structure of the debate, but the way we would speak to and address each other would be in a friendly kind of manner.
Okay. Was Eddie someone that you talked to on like before? Like, did you just have any relationship before the debate, or?
So yes, and so this was 2010. In 2007, Chad Vegas had been invited to speak on a panel set up by the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, a four-membered panel that was going to have a member of the Mormon Church, a member of the Catholic Church, Eddie representing secular humanism, and then a member of a Protestant church.
Okay.
And so one of the local bishops of the Mormon Church was there. One of the local Catholic priests, in fact, it might even have been one who teaches at BC, was there. Eddie was there, and I was there. And so we were really speaking on the question of the First Amendment, separation of church and state, and what would be our arguments or reasoning for defending a particular view of the separation of church and state and the First Amendment right to the freedom of religion, freedom of worship.
Oh, okay.
It was after being on that panel with him that Eddie came up to me and he said, "You're a Presbyterian. I recognize your methodology. I debated Greg Bonson years
Oh,
ago."
really?
That was our first contact.
Oh,
Yes.
man.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty neat.
So we chatted with each other a little bit after that. And then I got a second invitation in 2010, again from the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, to do a more formal, but not a perfectly formal, but a more formalized kind of debate with Eddie Tabash, again on a First Amendment issue. And so they were asking Eddie to speak to this, and then they contacted me and asked me to speak to this. And we were given a small room at Beale, and we overflowed that, and so we had to take 30 minutes to reestablish ourselves in the Beale Library Auditorium because we had somewhere between 120, 130 people show up. Many of them happened to be students from Bakersfield Christian High School, but there were a number of people from the community. And so we had this friendly kind of debate back and forth over whether the cross was a violation of the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause. And interestingly enough, in October of that year, that was in April, in October of that year when the Supreme Court gave back its decision, the decision was the cross could stand, that it didn't violate the Establishment Clause. And I was pleasantly surprised that in their opinion, their chief arguments mirrored arguments that I had presented in my case against Tabash's position.
Oh, man.
So that was because I'm not a constitutional attorney. I don't have a lot of training in this. It was after the 2009 April thing that we're walking out to the parking lot together, and that's when he proposes a debate. And he said, why don't we debate? He said, and so I'll offer two things to you. Does the Christian God exist, or does God exist?
That makes sense now. Okay.
Yeah. So, and my response to him was, well, we ought to argue the second question before we argue the first. I said, it's logically necessary for God to exist in order for the Christian God to exist. Because if someone disproves the existence of God logically, then of course the Christian God can't exist. I said, so in terms of, and I'm thinking this through, I'm a teacher, I'm a minor logician, very, very minor, but I think logically. So let's put things in their proper order. We would never have to debate, does God exist, if we went to the debate and I proved that the Christian God exists.
Right.
But setting up so that we might have a prequel and then another one, something like that. Well, he said that sure, that we would take that up. I didn't hear from him for 7 months.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't until November that he got in contact with me again. And I thought maybe he forgot about it. Maybe his schedule precluded it. Maybe he did a little more investigation of my background and thought that, Tabash has debated what we would call the A-team in the philosophical world. Robert Swinburne, William Lane Craig, back in the 90s, Greg Bonson. And I thought, why would he want to debate the B team? That's how I looked at it. So I thought he probably had just sort of given it up,
Right.
But he contacted me, and so we set it up for February. And it was a challenging but enjoyable event. The BCHS and the Christian community turned out in huge numbers. They estimate 1,000 to 1,200 people showed up for the debate.
Man.
The auditorium there, the gymnasium at Bakersfield Christian High School, was packed. They had to bring in more chairs for people to sit on the floor. And there was a contingency of the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. There were those who were fans of Eddie Tabash, and so they were there. But it was a very congenial. It was and the debate, by the way, was highly structured. Eddie set up the debate rules.
Okay.
And this will answer something that occurs later on. He taunts me as to why I'm not willing to talk about the Christian God.
Yeah, that was frustrating for me to.
But the fact is that when you set up a debate and you establish the question, if you don't address the question, you are, in terms of the forensic debate rules, you have gone off topic. And judges will actually score you down if you go off topic.
Oh, wow.
Well, he had basically said to me, this is the topic, this is how we're doing it, we're going to stick to this. And I said, I'm happy to stick to this. So that meant that I didn't, in any sense, touch the arsenal of other kinds of arguments that we might use with respect to Christ, his historicity, his claims to be God, the validation of those claims, all kinds of things that would support the concept of the Christian God. No, it was just the classical view of God that Judeo-Christianity provides, the God of the Abrahamic tradition, the God that's necessary to establish or state the classical problem of evil.
He was saying that a lot. Like, I think I remember at least 3 different times where he kept saying it over and over again. And I'm like, no. I was like, earlier in the debate, I think Randy even said.
I started out by making it clear that our specific topic was this.
Yeah.
And that's why we weren't going to go anyplace else.
But you even said too, in defining the classical view of God. I was going to ask you about that as well. When you were explaining the classical view of God, you included the God of Abraham. And Jews and Christians.
Yes.
And then you even clarified on your rebuttal, like, I'm not trying to shy away from it. And I know you wouldn't shy away from that. And I couldn't really understand why he was saying those things over and over again. I'm glad you clarified.
Well, and I had there was a temptation during the debate at that point to stop and say, we're following the rules that you set, Eddie. Mm-hmm. We're following the debate format that you set. So why are you trying now to bait me into breaking the rules that you specifically set and agreed to?
Right.
I'm being consistent. What you're asking me to do here is being terribly inconsistent to the groundwork for the rules of the debate. But I'm thankful that I didn't go that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, and this is something that I was talking to my buddies about. there's, and I know most people don't know who I'm talking about when I say Chad Vegas. He's my former pastor. I
Yes.
still consider him a pastor of mine. Like more,
Sure,
I see him more like a big brother to me. He's someone I go to a lot.
he's a huge influence in our lives.
Yeah, yeah, and he's taught me out a lot too. Now his method of debate, it's way different than yours. It's almost like it's almost like he has no issue of like making someone look foolish. At times I feel like he wants to do that, and
We who love Chad recognize that God has given to him one of the sharpest minds
Yeah.
that you can imagine, and what I would call a good type A personality. And so he ought to use that.
right,
I don't have that personality, and I had my whole church praying during all the weeks of preparation
nice.
that I would be a consummate gentleman.
That's
Because
actually- well, yeah.
because if you push me into a corner, my tendency is, okay, if you're going to play dirty, I'll play dirty too. And I was praying, God, don't let me go there.
Yeah.
As much as my heart may want to go there, don't let me go there. Let me be the way my church has prayed for me. Let me be the way that you want me to be, and let me conduct myself as a Christian gentleman in all of this.
That is, it's funny that you're saying that. This morning I was talking to my buddies about that, and I was like, you know what, my pastor, he's a gentleman. He's not going to start throwing low blows or anything. I mean, he's going to treat someone with respect. And I think of that verse in Timothy, where we respond in gentleness, and perhaps God may grant them repentance. Right.
Right.
I spoke about that on my recent episode last week. Actually, I spoke about that, and so I'm glad you actually. I'm personally glad you took that route.
Well, I'll say this. I had hundreds of students that I was bearing witness to, and especially my own senior students, where I had talked to them again and again about how they handle their research papers. And in the research papers, I said, I will grade you low if you don't treat the opposition, the position that you don't agree with. If you don't treat that position with the greatest amount of respect, you will get serious points deducted on your grade. So if I didn't treat Eddie with the utmost respect,
Right.
and to be the kind of person and gentleman that I thought God wanted me to be, I would have been discrediting my whole approach in teaching. And I want to live up to that at all times.
Right.
Sadly, I don't, but I think it's very important to strive to be that kind of person, and it's the kind of person I think God would want me to be.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No, amen. I definitely agree with that. I wasn't really expecting you to go there, but I was talking about that to my two
That's
buddies
interesting.
on the
Yeah.
East Coast this morning.
Yeah.
I just thought it was pretty cool. So
Yeah.
I was going to ask you next, how did you prepare for this debate?
My debate preparation involved two things. Obviously preparing the kind of argument that I wanted to present, but also researching my opponent.
Okay.
And there's a lot of information that Eddie has out there, a lot of YouTubes and so forth.
Right.
But there was one YouTube training session that he was doing up in the North Midwest, the Midwest up toward, it might have been in Wisconsin, someplace up there. He was doing a training seminar for atheists, young atheists, and he was training them how to debate Christians. And I thought it was interesting. He said it's so important for us to keep the pressure on and keep debating, because he said there are more Christians going into PhD programs in philosophy and the philosophy of religion, and the universities are turning out more very sharp Christians who can out-debate atheists. He made this admission, and that's why we've got to do our job. We've got to do it well. We've got to keep the pressure on. So he was feeling like atheism was getting hammered hard by, William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, these men who have done such a great job in the world of Christian apologetics, philosophy of religion, and arguing against atheism. So I watched that, and then he went to his methodology. And his methodology was this: overwhelm your debate opponent by the shotgun method. No, the submarine gun. What kind of gun is it? Submachine gun. The submachine gun.
Okay.
Right? Submachine gun. Something that spits bullets out very, very quickly in a very rapid pace. He said, this is what you have to do. He said, have no less than 10 arguments, and then shoot those arguments out there in your presentation as fast as you can and as often as you can. And in your rebuttals, Go back and hit those arguments again and again and again as fast as you can. And basically, you haven't answered this. You haven't answered this. You haven't answered this. You haven't answered this. Now, in a debate, formal debate like this, you have the statement. The question was, does God exist? So then the affirmative, yes, God exists, is required to speak first. The negative gets the second. And so in each of these cases, it's always the one who disagrees with the thesis who gets to speak last.
Right.
So I got to speak first, he got to speak last. And in some sense, okay, those are the rules of the debate.
Right.
Often the case is he who speaks last is the one that people remember the most.
Right.
It's why in the NFL, you want to be the receiving team as opposed to the kickoff team, because you want the opportunity to basically go on offense immediately in the second half, but you want to basically be on defense in the first half. You want to play it that way because that's a game strategy. Well, the same way in debate. So Eddie set it up to his advantage completely.
Right, yeah.
So in knowing this, I thought, okay, I'm not going to be able to adequately answer all of his 10 questions because each one of those kinds of issues he's going to raise requires something fairly thorough, laying it out very carefully, answering it very carefully. So I thought, what argument do I think is the most audience-friendly and the one that I believe is absolutely indefeatable by atheism? And I said, it's the moral argument for the existence of God.
Right.
Now, there were two reasons that was very important. One, like I said, I don't think the argument can be defeated. What we want out of morality, you can't get from atheism. And that was the big point of the argument. But secondly, again and again, Eddie, in his different presentations, would fall back on science, the authority of science, and the scientific method. Well, the secondary argument that I presented in the debate was if you cannot credential morality as an atheist, then you have a huge problem with your epistemology. Because what is required in the scientific method, for that to be a valid methodological approach to knowing anything about the world, and almost all guys like Eddie, philosophers, non-philosophers, scientists, so forth, miss this necessary truth. The scientific method doesn't work, and it can't work unless the scientist is committed to a metaphysical truth. The metaphysical truth is, I am morally bound to be absolutely honest as I go from step 1 to step 2, from step 2 to step 3, from step 3 to step 4, which means I have to be absolutely honest in my observation of the data. I have to be absolutely honest and committed to honesty and truth in my formulation of that data, in providing a hypothesis, in testing that hypothesis, and reporting the information concerning that hypothesis to the public. I have to be committed to a standard of moral truth as well as epistemological truth as I go through. Those are presuppositions which I have rarely seen those who defend the scientific method, those who claim that science is the ultimate track to knowledge, ever acknowledge and ever admit. The scientific method doesn't work unless there's a moral foundation to it. And think about this. Will the moral foundation of moral relativism help the scientific method? Well, moral relativism doesn't anchor anything in anything that's absolute. Will utilitarianism, where the end justifies the means, is that the way you're going to do the scientific method and say, it doesn't matter if we lie during the process as long as the outcome is what we want or the outcome is what we think is beneficial? No, the only kind of commitment to truth and honesty that fits the scientific method is one that you'll only find in a robust form of morality, which you can only get from the Christian worldview.
Right, definitely. I listened to the debate at least 3 times now, and one thing I noticed is that everything you said right now, the shotgun approach or the submachine gun, you said?
Submachine gun, yeah.
Yeah, it's you know what's funny? The first time I heard about that was on YouTube from an atheist speaking about Dr. William Lane Craig.
Yes.
And I remember I read that, and the way how they described it was very like, oh well, the reason why Craig appears to win all the time is because he says all these arguments, and then he goes back and says, oh well, you haven't answered my argument. And really, I think the Dr. Craig is a lot more sophisticated and
he's a polished debater.
Yeah.
And he knows how to play the game out there in the public.
Exactly, yeah. And even then, but his arguments alone, even in his videos, I mean, they're solid,
Yes.
And I mean, I'm glad you brought up the context of, or at least the background of the debate. I think it does help. A lot of times I felt like, kind of thought that Eddie was being somewhat disingenuous sometimes. But a lot of times I just kind of thought to myself, I'm like, doesn't he want to answer those kind of questions? Him saying stuff like, well, even if I can answer the question on morality, it doesn't mean God exists. A lot of times I just kind of thought maybe he just didn't know how to answer it. I remember the debate with Bonson. He had trouble there. Bonson was very, he gave him a test of his own medicine. And one thing he said, which I use for the intro, is just because someone has a sharp tongue doesn't mean they have a sharp mind. And he said that about Tabash, and I'm like, whoa, and so, the things like that, I think, and also Douglas Wilson, which I know he's going through a lot of criticism right now for his past theology. One thing he told Christopher Hitchens, he asked him a question, on what standard is God evil? And Hitchens was, he thought about it. He's like, oh, that's a good question. And he's like, yeah, I know. The question about morality and what you were hitting on, I think was foundational, and also was solid, but unfortunately we didn't get the answer there. But one thing I do kind of want you to speak on, which I think it was a really good tactic. I thought it was awesome that you did this. You drew a contrast, right? You said the atheists like to bring the problem of evil, while theists have brought the problem of morality. So can you speak a little bit more on the problem of morality? What's probably the best way to communicate? Is there like a syllogism that you go by?
Well, no, there's no simple syllogism that sort of mirrors the problem of evil. But the problem of morality is of two sorts. Well, let's begin by saying, first of all, if we're talking about morality, a moral system to be worth anything at all has to solve two conditions. It has to solve moral conflicts. Because if it can't solve a moral conflict, that is, you and I have an issue, I think you've done evil, you think you've done justice. If a moral system can't address that and bring that to a resolution to show who's right and who's wrong, then it is hardly worth calling it a moral system. Secondly, that context, you and I, won't work unless morality is something that actually embraces you and I, such that you and I both have to respect it and adhere to it. So the universality, morality must have universality over all people at all times and all places. And secondly, it must be able to solve moral conflicts. Okay. Now, there are any number of perspectives on morality today that actually fail that again and again. Everything dealing with postmodernism fails both of those. You can't solve any moral conflicts within a postmodern framework of understanding the world. It just doesn't work. And of course, right from the beginning, postmodernism rejects the meta-narrative. It rejects the idea that there's any truth that binds all people together at all times. Nobody is accountable to any ultimate meta-narrative. That's the claim. Well, the logical outcome of that is that you have no morality at all. Because whatever gives you the right to create your own morality, I have the same right to create my own morality. And when your morality and my morality come into conflict, for the ivory tower people to say, well, that's where you both need to be tolerant, then each of us can say, oh, but you're asking us both to agree to a meta-narrative in which tolerance belongs to this meta-narrative that binds everybody in every place, everywhere, that everybody in every place, everywhere ought to be tolerant with one another. But you've already said from the very beginning that there is no such meta-narrative. So postmodernism has no ability at all to establish or authenticate any kind of moral system. It can't solve moral conflicts, and it can't give you a normativeness that embraces everybody. Well, that's the problem with postmodernism. What about modernism? What about secularism and its attempts to establish morality? Well, if you read the Humanist Manifesto, it wants to get down to a kind of cultural moral relativism. So that it's only within certain communities. This community of the West, we've agreed that these are our moral rules. But we come into conflict with people of the East or the people of the South or whatever. Well, once again, the problem there is we have invented a morality that we're going to say is going to bind us. But it doesn't enable us to solve our conflicts with our near neighbors who see things differently. Right. Now, the reason why we know this is a real issue is the Germans who were tried in the Nuremberg trials post-World War II. Their ultimate defense was, who are you to say that what we did was evil? And they were arguing on the best lines of what was beginning to be the postmodern perspective, but even the secular and modernist project perspective on morality, and that is human beings create morality. We don't have morality given to us from above. The fallback position of the judges at the Nuremberg trials was essentially this. There is a morality that transcends every culture, that transcends your culture and our culture, and it's that morality that you're accountable for. Now, what the Nuremberg judges said was correct, but what the Nuremberg judges said flies in the face of what Nietzsche said before he died. Okay. So at the beginning of the 20th century, it became well known that Nietzsche had said, God is dead, or the gods have died, we've killed him. And so he was saying in his writings, why then do we as Europeans continue to use Judeo-Christian morality when we have already concluded that the foundation of Judeo-Christian morality is gone? And that's the point that Nietzsche was making, is that subtract out the God of this moral system, you have no grounding for this moral system. And if you have no grounding for this moral system, then there's no authority. So when Tabash would say, just because I can't answer the question of morality doesn't mean that God exists, the point is, well, I'm not interested whether you're smart enough to answer the question of whether morality exists. I'm interested in the fact that the best philosophers who are atheists have admitted that they can't ground ethics and morality in anything other than human decisions to say this is so. Right. Okay. And even Bertrand Russell said, there is no ethical premise unless we choose one. Mm-hmm. And he says he only knows of either you choose it or a government by virtue of power imposes it. Well, that's the problem of Europe in the Second World War. Hitler and the Nazis imposed their form of morality, and the Allied were continuing to cling to, barely, a Judeo-Christian morality. And there's Bertrand Russell, who's hating the war, and he's an anti-war kind of guy, but he's certainly believing that the Nazis and what they did were deeply evil. There's no grounding for it. So this is the problem of morality. The Christian looks at the way the world is and says, those who do not believe ultimately in the God of Scripture, they may choose to have a moral system, but that moral system has no authority because it has no grounding. No one has any obligation to follow it or to obey it. So.
Okay. I want to ask a question first, and then after the break, you can come back and answer. They typically say morality itself does not prove God. And I think parts of the debate, he was trying to argue that morality has nothing to do with what I'm saying. I want evidence, and knowing that God is not physical, that you could find somewhere in outer space. But yeah, I do want to go down that route after our break. So.
Okay.
Okay.
The question of morality ought to be at the forefront of Christians talking about their faith, Christians talking about the world, Christians even debating or discussing or dialoguing about the truthfulness of the Christian faith, because the problems in the world today are at the root of them moral. People like to say that, well, they're political. There's not a political issue that doesn't have its grounding or its origin in something that's essentially moral. Politics is about how we treat human beings in the aggregate. Morality begins with how we treat people at a very personal kind of level. Morality is how we treat and regard other human beings. The idea that there can be politics divorced from morality is as ridiculous as the idea that we can educate apart from morality. When school systems want to see children teachable, they try to inculcate in them certain kinds of virtues. The virtues are, we respect each other here. We have rules by how we're going to treat one another, how we're going to treat the room, how we're going to... All of those rules are essentially what we call moral rules. It doesn't matter if you disguise that by calling them something else. The truth of the matter is that the way we treat one another is what we essentially mean by morality. Morality is... and you can talk about issues like right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice. But all of that, those kinds of ideas and concepts, is all about how we treat one another. So I don't understand skeptics who would want to dismiss morality as not being essential to the question of God's existence. It seems to me that that's a kind of way of trying to divert the discussion and divert the argument from ground on which they find themselves anything but sure-footed. The best atheist philosophers have constructed ethical systems, but they recognize that those ethical systems are only grounded in rationality, a rationality which, if you have reasons for not thinking the same way I do, then my argument doesn't really compel you to be, quote, moral. We've seen this. In fact, I brought one of the books that spoke to this. It was written in the 1980s, Alistair McIntyre, about justice. It's essentially whose justice, which rationality. And his point was that in all of the modern debates we have in politics, and from the political level down to the personal level, we discuss justice again and again and again. And his point is, well, your understanding of justice is tied into your understanding of rationality. But if you don't understand the world rationally, the way another person understands the way the world is rationally, then your moral terms are going to be, in some sense, different from one another. You won't mean the same thing. And we see this clearly in capitalism as an economic system, but also a political kind of system. An understanding of justice doesn't mean everybody gets the same amount of the economic output. Justice doesn't mean that. But in socialism, that framework determines the definition of justice as meaning equal outcomes for everybody, that everyone gets the same amount. So there are very different ideas. So if you don't share the same presuppositions, if you don't share the same understanding of the world, then what happens to your morality is going to be deeply affected. What you mean by basic terms, good and evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice, will not be the same.
Right.
Maybe that diverts a little bit from the question of...
it's just, it helps because I think that's what it comes down to. One thing when it comes to like the presuppositional approach, some people think it means, or at least how some skeptics and even those who don't hold to this method, what they'll say things like, okay, well, I think it's up to the Christian to prove that morality means that God exists, or that objective morality. There are some atheists, ironically, who believe in objective morality, and we're saying that's the most inconsistent form to have of atheism. When you want to hold to objective truth and objective morality, or absolutes, and yet still remain an atheist. What's the bridge
sure.
there?
So it's easier to be an atheist who believes in objective truth and dismisses morality entirely than it is to be an atheist who believes in objective truth and objective morality. David Hume pointed that out. David Hume was a disbeliever in the existence of God. So he makes it very clear that he believes in objective morality, the objective world. he does himself, as a skeptic, point out problems with ultimately the scientific method because of the issue of cause and effect. I'm not going to talk about that. But Hume was one who essentially said that morality, and what we call morality, is simply the way we as English people, Europeans, and so forth, it's the way we react to situations we don't like. Mm-hmm. And so he basically said you can't tie in murder as something objectively evil because you can't derive that out of nature. So his point was the way the world is, the isness of the world, mm-hmm. never translates into the oughtness of the way we talk about things. It's the is-ought issue that really we trace it back to Hume. Mm-hmm. And the huge impact that had on how we thought and talk about morality is incredible, because every kind of moral system that tries to tie morality into the way the world is, mm-hmm. or put it this way, the way the world is we know descriptively. Okay. There is no ability for us to say, but the way the world ought to be, mm-hmm. ought to look like this. Right. Where do we get the ought? Right. And that's the problem. And Hume made it clear, and it's been impossible to get past this in the history of philosophy. Hume made it clear that we can't get the ought out of the way the world is. That is, you can't derive the idea that murder, properly defined, is evil, because you can't get out of nature what is evil and what isn't. Right. And especially this is true since Darwin. With the tremendous acceptance of Darwinian evolution as sort of foundational to the modern scientific view of how things are, we've seen that many things that happen that we would describe as part of the Darwinian process involve things that we would say, especially when it comes to what we are as human beings, we would say, well, those things aren't right. Those things are evil. People ought not to be that way. Right. But if Darwinian evolution is true, then the development of human beings for the sake of survival didn't start by saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Mm-hmm. It doesn't start with saying, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It doesn't begin with saying, do not bear false witness against your neighbor. It doesn't begin by saying, thou shalt not steal. All of those kinds of rules that we trace to what makes for a civil society in our world today, you didn't get them out of Darwinian evolution.
So about that, Randy, you actually brought up a really good point in I think it was the final question he asked you, and you actually made the point that like 5 of the 10 commandments or 6 of the 10 commandments, you can actually see it back in different cultures and around the world. I remember that, and he didn't really respond to it even in his last closing statement. And that's the one thing about this debate that was a bit frustrating. Is he was using that submachine gun approach to you, and you're catching as much bullets as you can, but at the same time, he wasn't really answering yours. With that being said, and I really do hope people go on YouTube or wherever the debate's online.
It's on Vimeo as well.
Vimeo, yeah. One thing that I just want to make a quick comment on, and before I ask you just one more question. The video that I saw was like titled like Edward Tabash thrashes Christian teacher or something. The comment section was filled of guys that were saying like, oh, we do know what's evil, and that's Christianity, or they would quote a master's in divinity, LOL, just mocking, mm-hmm. insulting, right? It's just a little strange to me that I see this pattern a lot, and I really despise it when Christians do the same thing, with guys like Dawkins, like they'll say like, oh, Dr. Craig smashes or destroys atheists, because the way how I see it, Randy, and like you were talking about earlier, if we really believe that our position is truthful, we don't have to appeal to slander or mocking. Clearly, you've been educated and you've been challenged a lot, and you can answer these questions, but at the same time, they want to just, instead of attacking your position, they attack the actual Christian, and it's a common thing you see a lot online. I think I told you before I started recording that some of these are thoughtless, because they'll say things like Christianity is evil, and we're saying, okay, well, if you think it's evil, by what standard are you using? Sure. There's no way you could be a moral person and be consistent if you're an atheist. It has to lead you to something outside yourself, and I think that's where the tag argument.
Well, you do see that what I was doing with Tabash was a form of the transcendental argument.
Yeah.
Right.
Our theology is what drives our apologetics. Would you agree?
So if you want to talk about methodology a little bit before we close.
No, I definitely want to talk about that, but I think more importantly, what I really want to ask you is your reference to free will.
Oh, free will.
Yeah,
Sure.
because a lot of people will say, "Oh, wait, he's a Reformed Presbyterian," and yet he referenced free will. So
yes, I'm not unfamiliar with Reformed people who get a knee-jerk angst when a Reformed thinker uses the idea of free will. So, need to explain something here. We're dealing with an argument that's about metaphysics. Does God exist? We're not dealing with an argument about soteriology, how people are saved. We're not dealing with an argument as to why it takes a particular atonement and divine election in order to save people. So we need to recognize that the discussion of free will has two distinct categories. The question of free will at a metaphysical level. The question of free will in terms of a soteriological context.
Okay.
So let all your listeners know with respect to the soteriological context, no human being, when he's dead in his trespasses and sin, has the, quote, free choice or free will ability to choose Jesus. It just doesn't exist.
Right.
But outside of that context, because he's dead in his trespasses and sins, he lives in a world where, number one, the world is not mechanistic. And number two, it's a false analogy to think that human beings are like robots. We are not, in any sense, programmed like robots. We definitely do not live in a mechanistic world. All of that is materialism. And we don't live in a world that is, quote, materialistic in the sense in which from Democritus in the ancient world all the way up to today would describe the world as materialistic. We don't live in that kind of world. We live in a supernatural world. We live in a world in where there's the physicality of things, but there's the metaphysicality of things. And there's no question in my mind that free will belongs to the metaphysicality of things, that it's our ability to live in a world of cause and effect where things matter and immaterial. And we are able to make choices that are certainly not determined by the physical nature of the universe. I had the opportunity in my undergraduate work at UCLA in philosophy to spend an entire course and quarter term of 10 weeks, one-on-one with a professor in the department studying the question of free will and determinism. So my background in that is thorough. My background in that is extensive in terms of having read a lot and dealing with it a lot and writing about it. And so all that we would say across the board, from William Lane Craig to Plantinga to Paul Helm and others, Francis Schaeffer was very strong on this. We don't live in a mechanistic world. Now, the other side of it is, having read Jonathan Edwards, having read Christian libertarians, having read others, J. Oliver Buswell, read Robert Raymond, all the systematic theologians as they write about free will, the conclusion I've come to, mentioned Gordon Clark in this as well, the conclusion I come to is this: the nature of free will, that what the confession calls our natural liberty, the nature of that is what we might say philosophically is a black box. Now, a black box is something like what the humans or the biological cell was before we developed the kinds of microscopes that enable us to actually look into it. Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. What Behe said was this: Darwin didn't understand the mechanisms that went on inside of the cell because he couldn't see it. And therefore his theory of adaptation through natural selection faltered because he didn't understand the mechanism going on inside of the cell. He had no understanding of mutation, nothing. Nobody yet has penetrated into the nature of the soul such that we can definitively state what free will is. However, we have said for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that in order to be morally responsible, we must in some significant sense be morally free. So when I point to the free will defense as a credible kind of defense against the problem of evil, all I'm really saying is that the way God has created the world never necessitated any human being to do evil. And we recognize that. The confession's very clear.
Yeah.
Did God foreordain Adam's fall? Yes. Did God cause Adam to sin? No. Now, people say, well, Arminians will say that's logically inconsistent. And I would say, you've never proven that to be the case.
Right.
And you can't prove that to be the case, because if that is the case, then you have a problem with, in the book of Acts chapter 4, that whole passage where the apostles pray and they quote from Psalm 2, and they recognize that what Herod and Pontius Pilate and all the rulers did in crucifying Christ, they did what your hand and your will predestined to occur. So are they morally responsible for everything they did against Christ? Yes. Did they freely choose to do those things against Christ? Yes. Were those things they did absolutely predestined? Yes. Is the Greek language there, by the way, the strongest way to express absolute foreordination and predestination of all things? Yes. So where does that leave us as a Christian thinker? We have to be, in some sense, compatibilist. We have to say that human free will in the metaphysical sense and God's sovereignty in its ultimate sense are entirely consistent with each other. I can't explain fully the nature of the one and the three and the three and the one in the Trinity. I can't explain the hypostatic union between the true nature of the divine and the true nature of that's human and coming together in the person of Christ. I can't explain how my individual and personalized sin is actually a consequence of Adam as the human mediator in the covenant of works. And I can't explain how my righteousness or how my sins were imputed to Christ. There are things there that Scripture clearly teaches. But how and why and all of that, I would put into that black box. That is to say, the Scripture teaches these things so clearly. I believe them. I don't think they're intrinsically inconsistent. I don't think they're illogical. They explain so many other things. And the power of any kind of theory is its explanatory power. So the fact that there's some black boxes in our theology isn't an issue to me, and has never been an issue for Orthodox Christian theology.
Kind of why I was asking you that question, whether you thought theology forms our method, because that was my next question, was about free will. It actually helps me understand a little more now when I hear these discussions between these Christian philosophers and how much they put down free will. And I'm like, the way how you describe free will is not really what I disagree with. I think we're missing each other here. So hopefully that helps people.
Sure, and I even see folks as brilliant as William Lane Craig and others, and their understanding of Reformed theology to be fairly deficient. And the deficiency there is that Arminian theology lost its commitment to the full doctrine of original sin, the Augustinian, Lutheran, Reformed doctrine of original sin, best articulated in the Westminster Standards, far better than the Continental Standards. But in the Westminster Standards, the doctrine of original sin, whereby we clearly see the representation of Adam in the covenant of works and the representation of Christ in the covenant of grace, such that what Adam did, all of us are guilty and accountable for. What Christ did, then all of us are justified and are recipients of. But the importance there is that Adam had full soteriological and metaphysical free will. Because Adam had the ability to choose to obey or to disobey. That's just crystal clear. Even though his fall was preordained by God, his freedom was even greater than the freedom of those who put Christ on the cross, because he had the freedom of contrary choice to do right or to do evil, whereas apart from grace, all human beings can only be choosing among the choices alternate kinds of things consistent with their nature, and their nature is such that the heart is deceitful above all else and desperately sick. And no man does what is righteous, no, not one. No one does good, no, not one. And they're dead in their trespasses and sins.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
You know, and we could say, Edward, this is essentially Edward's position. We all choose according to our nature.
Right.
And if our nature is spiritually dead, then ultimately everything we do is going to be contrary to what God would require of us.
One philosopher, he actually, in an interview recently, he said that he defines free will as basically any choice you make, you can make the opposite.
The Greek notion of free will was the idea of contrary choice.
Okay.
Pelagius had adopted the Greek notion of free will.
Okay.
And that's what Augustine comes along and basically says, and that's where the development of the doctrine of original sin becomes so important, so powerful, is that essentially Pelagius is denying the consequences of Adam's sin in such a sense that all the statements about us being dead, spiritually dead, Romans chapter 3 verses 10 through 18, all of that description of total depravity, essentially Pelagius was not giving that its due, not really crediting that as being an accurate description of what we are. Pelagius was essentially saying that we are in the same situation Adam's in. So any Christian philosopher who thinks that we have the power of contrary choice is wrong. We don't have the power of contrary choice. We can't choose contrary to our nature. Now, if it means choosing to do something in terms of contrary, that is, I could either love my wife faithfully or go sleep with a harlot.
Yeah.
If he's talking about that, no, the historic treatment of that has been, those are alternative choices.
Right, yeah.
Those are not really contrary choices in the sense in which the Greeks said it to begin with.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
Equal power in both directions. We do not have equal power in both directions under the fall.
Good. Yeah, well, that's good. So there you have it, folks. Pastor Randy does not believe in Arminian free will. So, no, well, that's good. One final question before you go. Is it biblical to baptize babies? That's for Brawley, because he's always trying to. I make a post about unity and love and everything,
Yes.
And the first thing he asks, "Do you baptize babies?" So that was for him there. But anyways, yeah, Randy, thank you so much. I really appreciate this, and I do think the debate will be helpful for people to listen to.
Thank you.
And is there anything you want to say before we close out? Or anything?
No, I'm fine. And well, I will say something about all the nasty comments about how lousy I did against Eddie Tabash. You can always say, consider the source. But secondly, I think you made the most incisive comment. To attack the man rather than attacking his arguments is always the ploy of those who aren't capable of attacking the arguments.
That's good. Yeah. I know we went over our time, but thank you. I know you're
welcome.
I know you're very
You're welcome.
busy. So
No, I appreciate the opportunity to do this,
yeah,
Dr. Earl.
and we should do it again. So
Yes, let's do it.